welcome everyone to another exciting episode in our series on Return to Zion. And what we're looking at tonight is a very specific episode in the story of Nehemiah. So this is in Nehemiah's kind of story cycle that we have in, of course, the book of Nehemiah. And we're zeroing in on it because it's going to show us two things. One is the situation, as we frequently see, the difficult situation of the people who did return to Zion, and that things were not very easy. We're also going to see, though, if you remember, there are last couple of classes where we've been talking about kind of the status of Torah in this period. And we're going to see a couple things. One is the way Nehemiah can kind of rely on shared values. On the other hand, we're going to see that where we would expect him to point to an actual mitzvah, an actual commandment, he doesn't do it. So let's kind of jump right in. Does anyone have any comments or questions before we start? Okay, great. So I am going to be sharing my screen. We're going to be reading from Nehemiah 5. We are continuing. This is kind of placed during the time that Nehemiah is building the walls of Jerusalem. He's having everyone build the walls. And while they do it, they have to be constantly on their guard because they are under threat from the surrounding nations and from other groups that want to stop them from building the walls of Jerusalem. Everyone needs to keep weapons on them. And then we take a switch to look at what's going on with the common people. At the same time, at least the way it's being presented, is this is at the same time as they have this big project of building the walls. And it's just a complete switch. It really seems like it's kind of brought in maybe from a different part of his story to kind of place it here. And I'm going to read, and reading from the beginning of Parakeh, from the beginning of chapter 5. V'tihi tzakat ha'am u'neshehem gdola el achehem haYehudim. So the nation and their wives, the cry of them was great to their brothers, their brethren, the Jews. Right? Yehudim, the Judeans, but we can at this point already say Jews. V'yesh asher omrim, banenu uvnotenu anachnu rabim, v'nikad dagan, v'nochla v'nichyeh. Why are they crying out? What's happened is a classic situation, and essentially the reason we have the shmita rule for debt slaves and for debts, right? That shmita essentially cancels debts, and that 6 years is the maximum you can have someone who is a slave, essentially an indentured servant because of debts. Because this is something that would happen to farmers in the ancient world all the time. You have a bad year, and you need to eat, and you also need seed for the next year. So you need to borrow that money and get it. And then what happens if you have a second bad year? You can't pay it back. That's when farmers start getting into cycles of debt. The way many countries in the ancient world handled this was every now and then, you never knew when, the king usually would happen not so much because of mercy for the farmers, but because the merchant class was getting to own more and more land and have more and more debt slaves. So as the merchant class would get more powerful, the king would be like, you know what? I'm canceling all the debts. Everyone go back home, right? The problem with a system like that is you never know when it's going to happen. So people don't want to loan. They don't want to lend money if they don't know if they're ever going to get it back. So instead, in the Torah, you have a system where you know that you've got 6 years. And at the end of 6 years, that's it. That's the end of the debt. And that the maximum time for an indentured servant is 6 years. What we're going to see here is a similar situation that we're having. Oh, and I do want to say that not everywhere in the ancient world did they care. I've mentioned before the area of Nuzi, where you can kind of see from contracts there, they had this weird law. You couldn't sell your land. So you could only sell your land to family. So what they used to do was adopt the person that they were selling to. So you have all these fake adoption certificates, and you can see this one guy getting adopted over and over as he buys up all the land, right? And that was a place where the king, in fact, did not cancel debt, and the merchant simply bought up all the land. And buying up a farmer's land meant essentially the farmer was your servant, because now they're working the land and they don't get to keep any profit. At any rate, so let's go back to what's going on in the time of Nehemiah. So the people are crying out, the people and their wives are crying out, and they say, we have a lot of children. Let us have grain to eat and live. Sdotenu uchramenu uvatenu anachnu orvim v'nikra dagan barav. And there are those who say, we are going to give our fields and our vineyards and our homes essentially as collateral. In other words, take our homes and our vineyards and our fields. Just let us have grain because we're starving. ויש אשר אומרים, לווינו כסף למידת המלך, סדותינו וכרמנו. And then there are those who just for their taxes, for the taxes of the king, in other words, for the Persian Empire, we can't afford the taxes, so we need to borrow the money for that. In other words, they're really not doing well. They don't have enough for food, either for their kids or even for their children, rather, or even for themselves. The degree is we have a lot of children, and that's why we need to borrow. The next degree is we ourselves are starving, and that's why we must borrow. And the final degree is we can't even afford the tax, and therefore we must borrow. Vata, kivsar achenu b'sarenu, kivnehem banenu, v'hine anachnu chofshim et banenu v'et bnotenu labadim, ויש מבנותינו נכבשות ואין לאל ידינו ושדותינו חרמנו לאחרים. And they're like, and now what has happened? What is the situation we now find ourselves in? Say these people who have been farming the land or growing grapes or whatever, and now have kind of given away or given away as collateral everything they own. They say now we are the same. We are the same people as our brethren. Their children are like our children. But we must take our children and our sons and our daughters and turn them into slaves. And some of our daughters are already, and it's meant to be I do think it's meant to be kind of, we're supposed to hear it both ways. We're saying we kind of conquer, we're subjecting our children to slavery by selling them into debt slavery, essentially, like by hiring them out as indentured servants. And some of our daughters are already subjected or are already conquered in a way that's inappropriate. These young women are in someone else's house and bad things are happening to them. They're in a vulnerable situation and bad things are happening. We have nothing to do about it. And now our fields and our vineyards have been given to others because we had to give them away as collateral. Essentially, we put them towards our debt. So we don't even have fields and vineyards to get ourselves out of the debt. And now we've lost our children into debt slavery. And who has taken in these children in debt slavery? Other Jews, right? Wealthier Jews with money. Vayicharli ma'od. Kasher shamati et zakatam v'tadvarim ha'ela. And Nehemiah says, I got very angry when I heard their cry and these things. V'yimalech li bi'alai. And so I was thought, what should I do? V'ariva et hachorim v'taskanim v'amra lahem masha ish b'achiv atem noshim v'ten alehem kila gdola. He said, so what does he do? He calls the nobles and the officers, and he says, you are lending, or taking advantage of loans that you have made to your brethren. And I raised a big crowd around them. He says, look at what you're doing. He says, I'm going to point out to you what you have done. He says, Anachnu kaninu et achinu hayudim hanimkarim legoyim kidei vanu. What did we do back in Babylon? He came straight from Babylon, Nehemiah. He says, what we did there was we bought back our brother Jews who had been sold to the nations. And now you are going to sell your own brothers, and we would also have to purchase them, right? And they were quiet. In other words, here we were what we did in Babylon was we redeemed slaves. And you're bringing people into slavery, what we have to buy them also because you brought them into slavery. And they were quiet and they didn't say anything. Va'omar lo tov hadavar asher atem osim. And I said to them, it is not good, this thing that you are doing. Halo biyirat Eloheinu telechu mecherpat hagoyim oivenu. He said, you should be going in fear of God, right? And not give the nations a place for us to be ashamed. וגם אני ואחי ונעריי נושים בהם כסף ודגן, נעזבה נא את המשל הזה. And he said, and I and my entourage, they had also been lending at interest, apparently, or at least lending. He said, we are going to abandon our loans. So he says, okay, so he's doing several things, okay? The first thing he's doing is he's saying, let's look at how ridiculous this is. Let's look at how ridiculous the situation you're creating is, and think of it that the whole point of what we do in Babylon was that we redeemed slaves, and you're bringing people into slavery. And then he says, look how you're bringing shame. You're bringing shame on us. This is not what you should be doing. And also he says, and I and my entourage will set an example. We're going to set an example. We ourselves, what are we going to do? We're going to cancel the debt. In other words, very clear, what should you do? You should cancel the debt. That's what you should be doing. And he's pretty clear about it. He says, Hashivu na lahem kayom stotehem, karmehem, zetehem, uvatehem, u'ma'at ha'kesef v'adagan hatirosh v'yitzhar asher atem noshim behem. Okay? Now, give back their fields, give back their vineyards, give back their olive tree orchards and their homes, and also give back the 100 pieces of silver, give back grain, wine or grape juice, and olive oil, the stuff that you have been claiming against them. Now, the word noshim here, again, does it mean you're taking an interest or you're simply pressing these claims against them? But it seems that one would assume that they were taking interest on the loans. So he says, listen, I want you not only to return the collateral, what I want you to do is I want you to actually give back what they need. Give back the produce. Don't take the produce of these fields that you've taken. Vayomru nashiv umehem lo nevakesh ken nase kasher ata omer. And they said, we will return it to them and we will not ask it from them. This is what we will do. We will do as you say. So, and I brought the kohanim, the priests, to essentially administer the oath, and I had them swear to it. Gam chatnina ana'arti v'omra kacha yina'er Elohim et kol ha'ish asher lo yakim et hadavar hazeh mibeito umigi'o v'chacha yena'or v'rek v'yomru chol kahal amen. So what did he do? He did a symbolic action. This is kind of a classic thing, particularly when you're calling on God to give retribution. He shook out his garment. He says, so should God shake out everyone who doesn't keep his promise from his own home and from the fruit of his own labor, right? And so he'll be completely empty. And everyone said, amen. Now, the whole audience said, amen. What's the kol kahal, the assembled multitude, right? Who's the assembled multitude? Nehemiah is not a stupid guy. He didn't just tell this to the people in private. He brought, if you recall, in the beginning of this whole section, he brought these officers in front of an audience and he confronted them in front of other people. So he knows how to do it, right? You shame them in front of people. You say, this is what I'm doing. This is what you should do. And then they said, yes, that is what we'll do. He swore them to it in front of everyone. And this seems to hold. So what we're seeing here is that he actually can do something that, like, if you read, like, right now we're reading Shmot, and Moshe is not able to. Moshe can't shame people. Whenever Moshe says, "Let's do this," Bnei Israel, are always doing the wrong thing. They're rebelling. They're complaining, and Moshe's like, "What am I supposed to do now?" And he's always going to defend them from God. He can't. He doesn't have the same ability that Nehemiah has, right? Which is to say, "Hey, we all know where we're coming from. We all know what we should be doing. You are standing in front of everyone else. How could you do this?" Right? And he can call on that to shame them into doing the right thing. Now, also, he himself has to do the right thing, right? And what's interesting is, what doesn't he mention in this whole story that we would expect him to mention? He doesn't mention the rule shmita ksafim. He doesn't mention the fact that after 6 years, you're supposed to cancel the debt. He doesn't say anything about it. Now, has there not been a shmita year and people are in trouble now until he wants to act now? Or is he simply not applying the rule of shmita to cancel a debt. He also is not applying the rule of not lending at interest. Now, we don't know that they're lending at interest. I was translating the root nun shin hey as to lend at interest. It could just mean to, like, you're required to kind of press for the money. But it doesn't really make, but then why are they lending, right? What's going on here? Well, they could be lending in order to grab the collateral, right? That could be it. So it's not they're not necessarily lending at interest here, but they're also not. He's not mentioning the rule of shmita. And this is why I wanted to compare with Yirmiyahu, which we're going to do in just a second. Yes, Cheryl, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm curious about the sociology going on here. Like, I mean, who are the people who returned from Babylon? Are they the upper class? They're the lower class? How did people know what land to farm? I mean, like, there's an exile. Who are there in here? And who's the merchant class? Are the merchant class people who stayed in Israel? Are they wealthier people who returned? I'm trying to get a picture.
Right. That's a good question. So let me paint a picture. So Nehemiah has come from Babylon, but the people that he's ruling are not. They're living there. Some of them may have returned from Babylon decades before. So who are the people who have money and who are the people who don't? The farming, what seems to be, is there seems to be, and again, a lot of times there's the myth of the empty land that no one had stayed. It seems that some people had stayed from the first exile up to the return to Zion because they were in the countryside, so no one exiled them, and they managed to stay. So some of them are still farming that land. Other people came and took land that was available, possibly also ancestral land, because people had been keeping their yuchasin, right? They had been keeping their genealogical trees. So it could be that some of them said, "Oh, this is my ancestral land. I know it." But it's very possible that many of them or most of them came and found empty land that they could farm, right? And then started farming. Now, the ones with money, I would assume, came with money from Babylon, or they just managed to do very well for themselves, which always happens. There are some people who just do better for themselves. So either they did better for themselves at this point, or I would assume that some of them came also with money from Babylon, and so they did well. Especially if someone's coming from Babylon and they're like, you know what, I'm not going to farm. I'm a merchant in Babylon, and I'm going to continue being a merchant. I'm just going to kind of expand. You can understand someone like that would have more wealth. Now, also, there's a noble class who at this point is part of probably the ruling class in Judea. And they, one assumes, would have not just have money, but they wouldn't be affected by agricultural cycles. Let's say you had a bad agricultural year, but you yourself are a scribe in the court, that's not going to affect you, right? If you're a nobleman or you're living off taxes. Yes.
If you had a trade, you're in better shape than if you're a farmer.
It seems that way, but we don't know. Just the fact that they're loaning money doesn't mean that they're not farmers themselves. They could be more successful farmers, right? I mean, there's nothing to tell us that they are merchants. We just know a merchant class, that was something from elsewhere. It's a kind of a classic thing for merchants to have ready cash and not be affected by agricultural cycles, and they can lend the money that's needed to farmers. So it makes sense. And the fact is, what we do know is that he seems to be turning to the nobles and the officials. So it seems, what it sounds like are the main people that at least that Nehemiah is holding responsible are the people who are part of the political framework of Judea, so that they have money and that they've been kind of taking advantage of the bad situation that their fellow Judeans have found themselves in. I see someone else wrote something in chat. Let me see what this is. Yafa says, shouldn't the debt servants have been freed at Shemitah too? Yes, right. So we don't know. Here, it's not even mentioned. Shemitah isn't mentioned here. That's what's so puzzling. And the question is it in people's minds or not? Remember, if you go by the account, and again, it's not for 100% for sure, but if you go by the approach that Ezra is after Nehemiah, and that Ezra reads the whole Torah, and some of the stuff are less familiar with, maybe people are less familiar with this rule. However, let's take a look at Yirmiyahu. Okay, now we're not in Return to Zion anymore. We're in Yirmiyahu, we're in Jeremiah, we're in the period before the first exile. I'm going to read from Yirmiyahu, Perek Lamed Daled, that's Jeremiah 34. And I'm reading from Pasuk Chet, verse 8. Hadavar asher el Yirmiyahu me'et Adonai acharei krot hamelech Tzidkiyahu brit et kol ha'am asher b'Yerushalayim l'kro lahem dror. Okay, what is happening? This is under the king Tzidkiyahu, Zedekiah, Tzidkiyahu. So under Tzidkiyahu, he is the king after the first exile, right? The first exile when the nobility is exiled. Michonya's uncle Tzidkiyahu, Matanya, who then his name is changed to Tzidkiyahu, he becomes king. And they release essentially the debt slaves. How do we know? Because it says there was a treaty that they signed with the king Tzidkiyahu, the whole nation that is in Jerusalem, to proclaim freedom to everyone. And now we're going to see what that means. L'shalach ish et avdo v'ish et shifchato ha'ivri v'avriyat chofshim l'vilti avod bam bihudi achihu ish. To release each person his slave and each person his maidservant, his female slave, though talking about Hebrew slaves, setting them free so that they would no longer work and slave their fellow Judeans. וישמעו כל השרים וכל העם אשר באו בברית לשלח איש את עבדו ואיש את שפחתו חופשים לבלתי עבוד בם עוד וישמעו ושלחו. So all of the officers and all the nation that came into this covenant to release their slaves, they essentially said they listened and they were no longer going to enslave them, and they released them. וישובו אחרי כן והשיבו את העבדים ואת השפחות אשר שלחו חופשים ויכבשו לעבדים ולשפחות. And what did they do? Afterwards, they reversed it and they took them back as slaves and as maidservants. So in other words, that didn't last very long. What is going on here? Possibly what's going on is that if you recall, this was a time of Tzidkiyahu, there was a time of rebellion, it was a time of difficulty, and what's possible is that there was an economic downturn and it was easy for them to release their slaves and maidservants because they didn't want to support them, they didn't want to feed. This is one of the hypotheses of what's going on here. Like, why did they release them and then why did they take them back? Like, if they just released them and say, oh, good, they're being, good Jews and they released them, but then why did they take them back? So one of the possibilities is they were having a really rough time, so they didn't want to have these extra mouths to feed. So they're like, oh, look, yeah, we're great, we'll release you. And then things turned up and they want some more people on some more hands to work. And they caught them and took them back and made them slaves again. It's a pretty crappy story. And there's a punishment promised. And that punishment cites what we were looking for in our story of Nehemiah. So God says to Yirmiyahu, to Jeremiah, Ko amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael, Anochi karati brit et avotechem, b'yom hotzi otam me'eretz Mitzrayim min beit avadim lemor. So I made a covenant with your forefathers when I took them out of Egypt from the house of slaves, saying, Miket sheva shanim tishalchu ish et achiv et ha'ivri asher yimacher lecha. After 7 years, you need to release the Hebrew slave that sold to you. And he shall serve you 6 years, and then you set him free. And your forefathers didn't listen to me. ותשובו אתם היום ותעשו את הישר בעיניי לקרוא דרור איש לרעהו ותכרתו ברית לפניי בבית אשר נקרא שמי עליו. But you returned, you essentially repented, and you did the right thing to release your fellow man. And you entered into a covenant in the house that my name is called, in other words, in the temple. ותשובו ותחללו את שמי, ותשיבו איש את עבדו ואיש את שפחתו אשר שלחתם חופשים לנפשם, ותכבשו אותם להיות לכם לעבדים ולשפחות. And then once more you desecrated my name, and you brought them back to be slaves. Right? And that's why, and I'm skipping a little bit ahead. So what will I do? Hineni koreh lechem dror num Hashem el hacherev, el hadever, ve'el harav, v'natati etchem leza'ava, l'chom ha'mechot ha'aretz. So I am also going to call dror. I'm going to call a release. What's the release going to be? To the sword, to disease, to hunger, to being a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. Right? And I'm going to bring this back on you essentially tenfold. At any rate, the promise is that now, of course, they're going to be given over to Babylon. And so the question is, when we look at Nehemiah, it doesn't come up at all. No one says, but there's a commandment, right? What is said is, how can you do this thing? How can you do this thing? This is a ridiculous thing for you to do when normally your job would be to buy the slaves back, to redeem them. And yet what you're doing is you are bringing them into slavery. As we saw when Ezra reads the Torah, there are commandments that people don't seem to be very aware of. And it seems that people are not particularly aware of these as commandments. We saw how Nehemiah cares about Shabbat, and it's very, very clear to him that if they don't keep Shabbat, bad things are going to happen. He doesn't really say that here. What's interesting also is he doesn't say, and God will throw us out of the land, right? What he does say is, how can you do this? This is a horrible thing to do. This is a bad thing that you are doing. This is a morally bad thing. And what's interesting is that is what gets to them. So it could be that he doesn't cite the law because he doesn't need to, because he knows how to reach these guys. And the way to reach these guys is to have a whole audience and in front of the audience say, look at what you're doing. And this is wrong. I am releasing any debt slaves that I have, and I am going to cancel all my debt, all the debts owed to me, and so will my entourage. And that's what I expect of you, right? And it works. It speaks to the power of Nehemiah as a leader, but it also speaks to the fact that at this point, people are on the same wavelength in terms of what should be done. You can call the nobles in front of everyone else and say, this is wrong. You shouldn't do this. Now, we can see something similar in Ezra. Let's take a quick look at this Ezra dealing with the foreign wives.
Miriam, could we say that they'd been exiled for the land like for 3 generations, and that the whole idea of shmita was not in like their consciousness, that they hadn't been actively doing it when they were in Babylon, or the people that remained weren't doing it either? And so they're not mentioning it because it's not their lived experience.
I think that's a really good point, especially when we compare it with Yirmiyahu, right? At the time of Yirmiyahu, you're right. Everyone's been working the land. It's in their mind. And here we have this break. No one's been on the land. No one's been thinking this way. And I think that's a good way of explaining it. Like, why wouldn't it be in their mind? Well, they haven't been, that's not what they've been doing. So they're not really thinking of it in those terms. And in fact, because they haven't been working the land that way, this seems to be the first time this is coming up as an issue. Right? This seems to be the first time this is becoming a major issue, that the farmers have fallen into a debt they can't get out of, and they're losing their children to debt slavery. And Nehemiah has to step in. So I think that goes along very well with your point. Yes, Danny?
If I recall correctly, according to the Chumash, an Eved Ivri, there are 2 kinds of Eved Ivri. One is somebody who steals and can't return, doesn't have the wherewithal to return what he owes, and then the Bet Din commits him to slavery. Another one is simply a debt slave, somebody who's got debts that he can't repay, and he voluntarily, in order to do that. It seems that in both in Yirmiyahu and in Nehemiah, what they're talking about is only the second kind, the guy who sells himself into slavery. Correct?
Well, I think that it would be, I think because that's the societal issue. The main problem, the societal problem, and the problem that we're talking about in both cases in terms of the whole class of people is in terms of regular debt slavery, where someone goes into indentured servitude because they owe money. And again, if you're a farmer and you've lost your fields because of your debt, essentially you're in indentured servitude because you are working your fields because you have nothing else to do, but the crops aren't yours. So you are essentially a slave to that person that now owns your fields. And that's what we see actually in the story of Yosef, when the Egyptians are slowly selling off different things in order to get grain during the famine. And the last thing they say is, take our fields and us. Take our fields and us and give us grain. Take our fields and us, right? So why? Because there's no division. As soon as you take our fields, you've taken us. As soon as you own our fields, you own my servitude because there's nothing else I can do. So that's the difficult situation of being a farmer in debt. Any other questions or comments before we continue? Okay, so let's...
I see that what you're emphasizing with Ezra and Nehemiah is that their task was how to build a society. That it's not enough that the people came back. and how do we build a moral society? And that they're invoking Torah, and in this case, Nehemiah is invoking shame to try and build a moral society from people who had the gumption to get up and come back to the land.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we see, especially with Nehemiah, because Nehemiah is but look, I'm a huge Nehemiah fan, right? So I just think it's great how he does things. He's very strong. He doesn't suffer. And he's very clear. This is what I need to do. And this is how I'm going to lead everyone. And it absolutely is this idea of, I'm going to, either with Shabbat, he's dragging people kicking and screaming, and here he's like, I can convince them to do this. And he does. And here we see that he's able to rely on the fact that at this point, everyone does agree that there's certain shared kind of rules and ways and what they should be doing. So let's take a quick look at Ezra. Okay. So this is what Ezra does. And we're going to come back to this when we talk about the issue of foreign wives, because we're going to come back. We're going to have a class just about the foreign marriages, which are a real problem in this period. So what Ezra does is actually, let's go back to the beginning. I was in Ezra Yehud in Ezra 10, and now I'm going to be in Ezra Tet in Ezra 9. And I'll read this, and we're not going to go into the whole thing because we don't have that much time left to the hour. Ezra finds out that there's this problem. וככלות אלה ניגשו אליי השרים לאמור לא נבדלו העם ישראל והכהנים והלוויים מעמי הארצות. כטובותיהם לכנעני, החיתי, הפריזי, היבוסי, המוני, המואבי, המצרי, והאמורי. He says, what's the people of Israel and the Kohanim and the Leviim, the priests and the Levites, have not separated themselves from the people of the lands. In this case, people of the lands does not mean the people of Israel who are on the land. Here it means from the people from the other nations, right? And they're doing like their abominations. And then it names people, some of whom are there and some of whom are no longer there. It's clearly drawing from the biblical verses, talking about the Knani, the Chiti, the Prizi, the Yebusi. They're not dealing with Prizi people here, but it's naming people from, so that we should recognize the nations from the Torah. What do you mean they haven't separated? Ki nas'u mibnotehem lahem v'livnehem v'tarvu zera hakodesh ba'amei haratzot v'yad hasarim v'asganim hayta ba'ma'al hazeh rishona. They took from their daughters as wives for them and for their sons, and mixed the holy seed with the nations of the land. And who did this first? Actually, the nobility. The nobility are the worst perpetrators here. So Ezra is devastated. He rips his clothes. He tears his hair out and his beard out. In other words, he goes into mourning. He displays signs of classic mourning, including things that we're not supposed to do, but things that all signify mourning. So the people who care all gather around him, right? And he sits desolate. He doesn't say anything until the time of the evening offering. And then what does he do? He goes and he prays to God. He prays to God in front of everyone, right? People are there. People are like, oh, wow, Ezra's having trouble. People have gathered. And in front of them, he prays to God. And he says, because of our sins, uvavon ased, mi me avot, I'm skipping, right? I'm skipping to Pasuk Zion, to verse 7. Mi me avotenu, and I'm reading from Ezra Tet, from Ezra 9. Mi me avotenu anachnu bashma gdola, ad hayom hazeh. ובעוונותינו ניתנו אנחנו מלכנו כהנינו ביד מלכי הארצות בחרב בשבי ובביזה ובבושת פנים כיום הזה. From the time of our forefathers, we have been in great guilt until this day. And because of our guilt, we have been given into the hands, our kings and our priests have been given into the hands of the kings of the land, right? Through sword, through captivity, through pillage, and in great shame as of this day. Okay? And now, just for a moment, we've had this reprieve from God. Like this time that we were allowed to come back from land, It's been like a second. That we should have someone remaining. To give us like a little stake, almost like a little tent peg, right? In the place of his holiness. So that God can put light in our eyes and to give us a little sustenance in this time of servitude. And it says again, we remember that we are servants of God. And vayat aleinu chesed lifnei malchei paras latet lanu michya l'romem et beit Elokeinu u'la'amid et chorvotav v'latet lanu gader b'Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. And God gave us chesed. He had the king of Persia look favorably on us to give us food and to raise the temple and to set up its ruins and to give us a wall essentially in Judah and Jerusalem, right? We've been able to even come back to Jerusalem. And now, what can we say our God? Remember, he's praying, right? What can we say our God after this? Because we have deserted your commandments. Asher tzivita biyad avadecha neviim le'mor ha'aretz asher atem ba'im le'mishta eretz nidahi. And saying what you said, that the whole land is unclean because of the nations. I'm saying it briefly. It's adding extra stuff, right? You should not marry your daughters to their sons. You shouldn't take their daughters for your sons. And you shouldn't ask after their well-being. In order for you to be strong and to eat from the good of the land and to leave it for your sons forever, right? So in other words, what are we risking here? He's going to say it straight out, right? I'm skipping ahead. הנשוב להפר מצוותיך ולהתחתן בעמי התועבות האלה, הלא תאנף בנו עד כלה לאין שארית ופלידה. Are we going to return to break your commandments and to marry these nations of abominations? Will you not be angry to leave no further remnant? In other words, now if we do this now, you're going to destroy us completely. Hashem Elokei Yisrael tzadikata ki nish'anu pleita kayom hazeh hinenu lefanecha bashmatenu ki ein la'amod lefanecha al zot. God, you are righteous. We have remained before you a remnant today. We're before you in our guilt because we cannot stand, we cannot be sustained in front of you with this. So he's praying and weeping before God, please don't kill us all, right? In front of everyone. And everyone is watching, and this whole crowd comes, right? He's doing it in front of the temple. Right? So everyone is coming, all the people and women and children, and the people are all weeping with Ezra. ויען שכניה בן יחיאל בבני אלה, ויאמר לעזרא, אנחנו מעלנו באלוהינו, ונושב נשים נוכריות מעמי הארץ, ועתה יש מקווה לישראל על זאת. And Shechaniah, the son of Yechiel, the son of from the sons of Elam, someone who we are clearly supposed to know, in other words, an important person, says to Ezra, we have in fact essentially sinned to God, and we have brought these foreign women into our homes, but we still have hope. There's still hope. And essentially they make a covenant and they all take an oath, very much like the oath that was taken before in front of the priest by Nehemiah to forgive the debts and to return the crops to the people. Here, they're all going to go into a covenant and they're going to essentially separate from their wives, right? And Ezra doesn't eat. He's in mourning. A proclamation goes out that everyone should gather to Jerusalem. Anyone who does not come is going to get excommunicated and lose his property. They all come, they all assemble, and essentially Ezra gets up and lectures them. They all listen. He's like, you've got to separate. And they say, yes, we have to do it, except it's raining. They say, it's rainy. Can we go home? This is going to be a mess to clear up. Can we go home? Because it's rainy now and we don't want to be out in the rain. And he's like, okay, fine. But they leave the people in charge, right? And they all have a schedule so that they can make sure that everyone is doing this. So I'm going to come back to the foreign wife problem because it's a repeating problem. It's not just Ezra's problem. We see it repeats in this period. But what we see here is that Ezra does something very similar. Not quite the same thing of going directly to the nobility, because here it's not just nobility, it's apparently everyone. But what he does is he relies on the fact that he can say something and everyone will listen. He can say, oh no, we have sinned. What will happen? We will all end up dying and being exiled. And the people who hear him will say, that is correct. That's right. And they'll all agree and come together and do this very difficult thing. I mean, they've got wives and kids, right? But he knows he knows that everyone's going to agree when they hear it. They're going to be like, oh, that's right. God said we can't do this. And we're going to get punished for this. It's going to be bad, right? And he's able to draw on those lessons to have an effect. Now, I do want to say that this is not something, again, this is a repeating problem. So depending on where you put Ezra in the timeline, if you put Ezra before Nehemiah, it's a problem that comes back. If you put Ezra after Nehemiah, then maybe it's something else. But this is a problem that is a continuous problem because, of course, everyone's been mixing and everyone has certain things in common because everyone's been part of the Persian Empire. Something that used to not be true, where you would have a very, very much bigger cultural and language differences. Although there are language differences, right? We'll talk about it when we talk about the foreign wives, about the problem that the little kids just speak Ashdodi, right? They speak Ashdodi. They don't even speak Hebrew. But what I want to point out is there's an idea of shared values / shared Torah that the leaders at this point can call on and say to everyone and have a soft way of influencing people to get what needs to be done or what they want to be done. Now, let me just see. Susan wrote in, since the Bnei Agola are called to Jerusalem regarding the wives, is the implication that those who managed to remain in Judea did not intermarry? No. The reason they're called Bnei Hagolah is because the way the whole book, Ezra and Nehemiah, talks as if, that's why I was saying the myth of the empty land, that's what they call it today, right? Is it pretends that no one stayed. If you read Ezra and Nehemiah, it pretends like everyone who's in the land is someone who returned from Babylon. Now, this isn't true. You can see even from the census that's in the beginning of the book that it seems to be that there's already a whole bunch of people. As soon as they return to the land, there's already people in different little towns all over the place. So it doesn't seem to be true, but it's consistent in that it will always call everyone Bnei Hagolah. They're all considered returning exiles. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so this was an interesting view of kind of the difficulty it was that people who returned to Zion, another view of the difficulty that the people who returned to Zion had in terms of their welfare, a glimpse into Nehemiah's strength as a leader, and also a glimpse into what the shared culture and belief that we have in this period that leaders are able to draw on without having to convince people of kind of the basics. I like to compare this with our stories of Moshe, where Moshe Rabbeinu has to deal with a bunch of people who are constantly arguing with him. And what we have here is not quite the same thing. It's not that everyone agrees, and we know that Nehemiah had problems with some of the people, and I'm sure Ezra did too, but there's an idea that we have a shared idea of what we're supposed to be doing, and that's something that leaders can draw on. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next week.